even though we actually can't be in person. So we will make sure to add your questions into the discussion so that your voice is heard and we make sure that we cover everything that you want to hear. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Sam Blake and Troy Carter.
All right, thank you, Kelly. And hello, Troy.
Hey, Sam, how's it going?
Hanging in there. As Kelly said, happy to have put 2020 in the rear view, hoping for brighter days.
Absolutely, same.
It's good to have you. I'll just echo what Kelly mentioned to the folks out there listening in. Thanks again for joining us, and certainly, yeah, if you have any questions that you'd like me to try to get to Troy today, please don't be shy about using the Q&A function, and I'll try to work them in as best I can. So Troy, you've been in the business of managing music talent for quite a while. I'll try not to date you too badly, but you started pretty early on in your life, if I'm not mistaken, around 1990. And obviously a lot has happened since then. Yeah, the internet, piracy, streaming, mobile phones in every pocket. And so I kind of wanted to start our conversation by sort of discussing how the music business has evolved throughout your career, and I wanted to start with the latest. So tell me a little bit about the goal of your latest products that you launched through Q&A, Venice and Stream Rate, and how they fit into what you're trying to do at Q&A.
Yeah, the idea is to, can we make the music industry run more efficiently and be able to allow labels and artists to make smarter and more informed decisions. I think, when we looked at some other industries, specifically in enterprise software and in technology, it's, you have these highly focused products that are solving problems on a granular level because they really understand the customer well. But I don't think people have really focused on the music industry that much. So the idea with Q&A was, can we build products and services that power the business of music?
And then can you tell me a little more specifically about each of the two new products? Maybe start with Venice.
Yeah, so Venice is a workflow product. So, the problem is when you're managing, whether you're managing an artist or whether an artist is on your label, you have music that's in Dropbox, you have stuff that might be in WeTransfer, you have, lyrics being texted to you from this place. Yeah, one thing is in Google Cal. So it's all of these different, like this Frankenstein sort of workflow. So just being able to introduce a much easier workflow. Distribution, I think that sits at the center, just because releasing music essentially is the what keeps the business going essentially. So we started off with distribution. Roster management is the next update that we're pushing, but basically you'll be able to manage your entire record label through one platform.
So that's a product that's designed for labels, and as you and I have discussed, you guys have even talked about internally, the way you think about what a label is actually quite broad. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, I think, the way we had to look at it was, where, you have certain products that are focused, that are very artist focused, and you have other products that are very record label focused. And the way we thought about it was, if an artist is releasing music independently, they still run a label essentially. So they should be organized with the same tools that a larger label would be organized with as well. So, we look at it from, sort of artist-owned labels up to, larger labels. So, but everybody's a label essentially if you're releasing music.
You mean I can be a label?
You could be a label.
Wow. So that's the sort of the workflow. The workflow is the focus of Venice. Now, tell us a little bit about Stream Rate.
Yeah, Stream Rate kind of spun out of Venice because we were looking at how much money is actually spent on unresearched music. So it's the sort of you throw music out there, you see what the reaction is going to be, but you already shot a music video. you've already, shot album artwork, you've spent money on promotion, all of these things, and then, without getting real feedback. So, with Stream Rate, we just built a product to be able to get some early indicators on how songs are received, and just to get a feel for your music before it's put out into the world. So in the past there's been things done specifically around radio, but it was still pretty antiquated. So we just decided to focus on that area because we feel like it can make spends way more efficient when you have an idea of who the audience is and whether or not the song is going to get the reaction you're looking for.
So you've got one on the workflow side, one kind of on the feedback from a song side, early feedback. And I know that that's a combination of getting feedback both kind of in an automated digital sense, as well as with a human sort of more subjective touch. I'm curious, between those two, Troy, is there a priority as far as what you're focusing on?
Yeah, I think it's the problem is the priority. So I don't think I don't look at them as workflow and research. I look at it as all part of the workflow, and Stream Rate is just the initial part of the workflow. Because before you release a song, you actually want to know, should this song be released? So that's a very important part of the work of the workflow.
Got it. And since we last spoke, I'm curious, how's the feedback been?
Really good. We got a pretty extensive wait list right now. The idea is to really curate who we put onto the platform, be able to get some real learnings, making sure that we can super serve, people that are coming onto the platform. So, but we want to be able to get it right.
Sure. I'm sure your clients would like it to be that way as well.
Exactly.
So Troy, now so that's kind of the latest, and now thinking a little bit about how the industry has evolved. When you and I previously spoke, one of the things we talked about was how some of the great discoverers and developers of talent throughout the history of the music business, if they were alive today, like take Berry Gordy of Motown, the essence of what they'd be looking for in a musician wouldn't necessarily be different, but maybe the tastes of the audience and the eras would be different. But one thing that we didn't talk about, and which of course is much different today from, say, the Motown era, is, or even when you began, is how and where young people are spending their time. And obviously younger generations tend to drive big changes in how music and entertainment are consumed and demanded. So I'm curious to hear what you have to say about how the habits and behaviors of Gen Z have changed the game when it comes to building up a musician and especially reaching fans where they're at.
Yeah, some things are much easier than they were in the past. Some things are much harder. I think, what you and I touched on previously was that, the fundamentals of a superstar hasn't changed, in terms of, and being able to sign a captivating artist, who works hard, who has, talent above the rest, who knows how to really interact with fans, and who actually has a point of view. And, and that's the sort of commonality amongst superstars, essentially. And that's the thing that separates superstars from recording artists. Everybody could be a recording artist. Everybody can't be a superstar. So I think the fundamentals have pretty much stayed the same. In terms of taste is just, it constantly evolves as music evolves. And and that'll be ongoing through, the history of mankind. Taste will change. The difference now, though, is, to your point, at one point, music set was almost a centerpiece of whether it was how the hi-fi might have been the centerpiece of the household, and you weren't competing with television stations or, all of these things or whatever. And now, you sort of fast forward, not only are you competing with 50,000 songs that come out per day on streaming services, you're also competing with Netflix, TikTok, gaming, news feeds, is all of these things that you're competing for. The good thing with music, whether you're leaning into music, to say, I'm going to actively listen to XYZ artists, the, the inverse though is music plays in the background the same exact way. So it's like, so music sort of flows within your life. The question is whether it's active or passive.
So by that, I mean, by that logic, one could think that, like you said, on one hand, with streaming and Netflix and TikTok and gaming and Snap and all these other options that I guess particularly for Gen Z, but really everyone has, and seemingly in ever greater abundance. It's a competition for, especially for those, I guess, those active sessions when, maybe of yesteryear, when people would gather around the record player, and now they're obviously not doing that, but those are also opportunities, right, for to get people's music into people's ears, I suppose more in a passive way, as kind of the background of a streaming series, of a video game. I'm curious, with that idea, and I think a lot of my reporting has looked at, just the folks I've talked to have kind of looked at, if as we're approaching, some element of peak streaming where, there's only so much time in a day, and for kind of Spotify listening or Apple Music, folks that are looking to spread their awareness of their artistry and of their songs are going to need to look to these other avenues. And I'm curious, let's say I'm a musician, and I'm working with you, Troy. Like, how do you even go about, thinking about what video game could I get my song into, or what Netflix series should I be like thinking about trying to get, accompany have my music accompany? Can you give me a sense of, like, as those different options have evolved, how you see the industry evolving in the way it thinks about getting music distributed beyond sort of traditional distribution channels?
Yeah, like I think with streaming services, I think overall, it's a great place to have your music sort of distributed to the most people you could possibly to distribute to, right? The problem is it's very passive, because you context and emotion is what builds those connections, whether it's to artists or to a song. And so, it's a difference between hearing something on a playlist and saying, "Oh, that song is really good." But when when you see it in a scene of a TV show or a movie where it's contextualized around that scene, it strikes a different emotion with that. Or if you even down to whether it's YouTube UGC content that people might be making to it, or whether it's TikTok content that people may be making to it, it's this contextualization around the song that makes people lean in. So we look for indicators like Wikipedia spikes. So when you release a piece of content, do you see the Wikipedia spike? Because that's a great indicator of a high level of interest when people want to know who the person is, who the artist is. So it's things along those lines, but context is the most important thing. And then the which places, which video game or show or things along those lines is really about authenticity, and is also about does this song fit into this commercial, or does this song go well with with the backdrop of this game. And sometimes it might be as simple as getting a high energy song on a Nike workout playlist, because people will connect their physical activity of how they felt with that in that moment with with that particular song. So it's things along those lines.
Got it. And then I guess specifically with gaming, I'm curious just if you could tell me a little bit about what you think as far as the growing role of itself, a hugely growing industry that gaming plays with helping musicians develop, and I guess maybe even if you could also detail like which types of musicians are we? I mean, when I read about that and talk to folks about that, it's I'm curious your thoughts if that's more of an avenue for very well established artists versus perhaps folks that are kind of still working towards breaking in. So we'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think just generally speaking, music works incredibly well with gaming. And I think, when you think about because I think a lot of times people kind of think of, because we're investors in FaZe Clan, for instance, right? And so that is the lowest hanging fruit when it comes to sort of thinking about hip hop culture with gaming. When you see the sort of lifestyle that FaZe Clan lives, you look at the type of artists that they associate with and the type of artists that they sync within video. But when you pull way back and you look at gaming as a category, you could think about classical music, you could think about country music, you could think about jazz, you could think about folk, you could think about pop, you could think about, all of these different genres, because for the most part, most people around the world play some type of game. So, for me, I like playing spades online, but the platform that I play on doesn't have a mechanism to listen to music. So, but it would be great to be able to listen to music or even integrate artists into those games, because a lot of artists and athletes actually play spades. So how do you integrate music there? So I think there's a lot of opportunity that's being left on the table within that space right now, because I think both industries are narrowly focusing on what that integration of gaming and music actually looks like.
Right. So when you think about that future integration and the opportunity, and I think, I feel like a lot of the growth of gaming is just some awareness of people wanting more and more interactivity and as opposed to the passive experiences that, are there alternatives. And I'm curious, when you think about that confluence of gaming and music and growing toward a more connected experience, do you think that's being driven more by the music industry or by the gaming industry?
I think it's a combination of both. Like, where that's why I like FaZe Clan a lot, because Lee Trink, who's the CEO, Lee comes from music and he was a talent manager and he managed Kid Rock and he ran a record label. And so he understood that culture of connectivity and what it means to build real fan artist relationships. And because that's the part where I loved about like the culture piece was a gap at most in most gaming companies. And I think now we're starting to see this sort of merger of cultures. And I think when we see that, like another example is when you saw in like the mid 90s, when NBA basketball and music really started merging together. And now it's almost like one and the same. It's like it's just kind of baked into the culture. And then and we're starting to see that a lot in gaming now, of that cultural sort of integration. But I think what gaming really knows how do you keep people's attention? How do you take them on new adventures? How do you build community? So is things that gaming does that music can learn from as well. The engagement side is just off the charts.
Right. And as a testament to that, I mean, we hear so much about not just within music, but in many other industries talking about, adding gamification and adding mechanics of gaming to drive that engagement. So just a couple more questions for you, Troy, and then I'll kick it back to Kelly and we'll carry on. Two more questions for you. One is there's a lot of talk about how kind of the quote unquote middle class of musicians has eroded over time, and the spoils of streaming, which sort of saved the industry as a whole from its demise largely caused by piracy, mostly go to record labels, and the remainder of it, go to sort of the upper tier of recording artists. And that's partly due to what you mentioned earlier, that there's just so many more songs coming out every day, 50,000 or so across streaming services. So much competition. But I'm curious, but there's also obviously more opportunity than ever to create your music, to distribute it. So I'm curious where you come down on how being a musician today, compared to say a decade or two ago, it compares to in the context of one's ability to actually make a living.
Yeah, one, it definitely depends on talent level, because I think talent matters in this particular case. But I think there's way more opportunity. So when you think about, when I hear that argument, it just kind of takes me back to thinking through, we lived in a day where you had record companies that picked who the stars were going to be, radio stations that picked which stars that they were going to actually play, MTV or BET that picked, which couple of dozen videos that they were going to play. And that became in magazines essentially, or late night talk shows, and they picked the stars. So it was no other real way, unless people went to record stores and dig through crates and of records and that sort of thing. So it's way more opportunity than it was before. And then when you look at, I think there's a really bad structure in place with deal structures between record labels and artists when it comes to payments from streaming services, because streaming services pay out a ton of money. It's like, you just look at the Spotify's a public company. So you could see what they pay out to rights holders. Whether the rights holders share that with artists, that's a different story. And that's where, things need to be fixed.
Last question, and I'll ask you for a quick answer, maybe 30 seconds or less. What do you think will be the most lasting impacts of the pandemic on the music business?
You can't give me that question and ask for a quick answer.
Boom.
I don't think there's a simple answer to that, and I think the jury's still going to be out. But I do think, it's obvious that live streaming is gonna stick. It's obvious that remote is gonna stick. So the way you move artists around the world, and then I think also platforms like Clubhouse that that sort of debuted during this time period, where like it's just this real direct way of communication that I feel like is better than a lot of the other platforms. I think we'll definitely see some innovation that we look back that say that happened during this time period.
Got it. All right. Well done carrying that last question and getting it done quickly. So Troy, thank you so much. Really good to reconnect with you. Really thank you for taking the time, and look forward to speaking with you again soon.
No, same here, Sam.
All right. Kicking it back to you, Kelly. Thanks, everyone.
All right. That was a really fascinating discussion. And I hope that we don't stay remote, because I personally want to go back to Coachella. That's been on the top of my list since moving back to Los Angeles. But thank you so much, Troy and Sam, for sharing your thoughts with us. I loved the point around what distinguishes a superstar from a regular recording artist. Be sure to check out Sam's Q&A with Troy from last year. It's up on our site, and Annie popped that link in the chat below. But let's dive in to the next discussion. We're going to switch from music to the world of film. And I'm so happy to welcome Reenas Ronson, the co-head of the independent film group over at UTA, and Jim Minahan, the other co-head of UTA's independent film group. And he's also the head of business affairs, motion pictures at UTA. So Reenas, Jim, welcome. And thank you so much for joining us today.
Hi. Hello.
Hey.
I'm sorry I missed half of the other one. It sounded fascinating. To check it out after.
Yeah, definitely. And for everyone, a playback will be available on our website afterwards. But listen, to kick us off, I'd love for each of you to share with us a bit about your background and what it is you do, so our viewers have context for this discussion. Of course, a lot of us have watched Entourage, so we know the dramatized version of agencies, but I'd love to get more of a realistic sense of what your world looks like, and specifically the piece around independent film. So Reena, why don't we start with you?
Hello. So I, obviously, co-head the independent film department here. I started my career actually in international distribution, which is really led me to the agency business. And international distribution is essentially distributing or finding homes for films all over the world. So outside of the US. So for me, what I wanted in my career was to learn what everyone wanted all over the world, so then I could go make it. My interests were always in producing and creating, and which is ultimately what we do within the agency without, the producer title. But I started in distribution and came into the agency. Really, it was in the I want to say the early 90s. When the international market was booming and there were opportunities to actually get films financed by utilizing the international space. So that was a good 20 plus years ago. I was at William Morris and launched their independent division with a colleague of mine, Castian Elways, and our goal was to raise financing for films by using international and equity. And so that sort of morphed into the agencies all over the US, setting up these departments, which were focusing on how do you raise money for your clients, your writers, directors, talent, to figure out how you can get those movies made. And so our focus is a little bit different from the talent agents you see on Entourage or elsewhere, because we often work with everyone, and our clients can be filmmakers, writers, directors, financiers, and our goal is to set up films outside the studio system. So anything that is independently put together typically is set up outside the studio system in some form or another. That's a general of what we do.
Yeah, and I my background is I was a lawyer originally. I guess I still am. So I was at a law firm in the Silicon Valley when I got out of law school, and I really didn't want to do that. And I wanted to be in the entertainment business. So I got a job. My first job was at Disney Pictures. So I worked in Walt Disney's, feature group for a few years. And then I moved to a couple different production companies. One was called Walden Media. One's called Icon Productions. And at some point, I was convinced by other people that moving to an agency was actually a more interesting, dynamic place to be. I never thought I would have been on the agency side. And now, 12 years later, here I am. But one of the big draws, so I came in as the head of business affairs, I still am. But one of the big draws of coming to the agency was actually getting to work on the independent film side. So Reena and I have worked together hand in hand for a long time. And so I've got sort of my feet in both, whatever you call it, pods.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for sharing a bit about your background. I think we'll definitely dive into that international piece, because the global audience in film is becoming more and more important. But first, let's start with a discussion about how all of this is affecting the world of independent film. So of course, every year around Oscar season, these theater chains run award season favorites, as the majority of the film going public realizes that there are films outside superheroes. And unfortunately, I have to give myself a slap on the wrist. I'm one of those people that realizes, oh, wow, there's all of these wonderful films out there. But there was a lot of pressure on that dynamic already. And the pandemic has only exacerbated that pressure on the theatrical window, with theater chains being closed during this time. So let's start broad. From what you've seen, how is the world of independent film changing because of streaming? And Reena, Jim, feel free to jump in.
Well,
yeah, go ahead, Reena.
No, I was going to say it's interesting, because even before the pandemic, it was getting very competitive between the theatrical distributors and the streamers. So no pandemic, and it still was the fight for getting material and great stories. The issue there was mostly it was a money play. You know, the streamers had deeper pockets, but a lot of filmmakers really wanted that theatrical experience. Their film really was intended for the big screen, and so the battle was really, what's best for that film? What does the filmmaker want, and how can we help them achieve that? Now it's turned on its head a little bit, and there's this, and you know, and Jim and I can talk about a couple of films even last year that we were selling, where the filmmakers really insisted and wanted that theatrical experience. Two films, Big Time Adolescence and Palm Springs, which we can get into a little later. But so we did do our deals with streamers combined with theatrical distribution companies. And then it turned on its head and pivoted because the pandemic hit. And so it was ironic and interesting, but we had that sort of safety net that they were films that actually had the opportunity to be, you know, to go on a streamer and bypass that theatrical. Not saying that's good or bad, but it was what happened. So it accelerated really what was going on in the industry.
Yeah, and we've also talked about this. You know, it used to be when we would go to festivals and sell movies, the theatrical distributors would come and do most of the bidding, and the streaming platforms would be sort of a part of their package. That would be their, what we used to call their pay TV window. But you'd be talking to the theatrical buyers and making deals with them. And the shift over the last couple of years has been just that the big streaming platforms have come in and, you know, negotiated for themselves, and they have become, you know, buyers by themselves. And sometimes they bring in the theatrical distributors, the specialty labels, to help them, you know, be more competitive. Because, you know, everybody in our ecosystem still wants there to be theatrical releases. And I think, you know, COVID has just accelerated. COVID has just put a pause on theatrical releasing during the pandemic, but I don't think any of us believe that theatrical releasing is going away. We just got to wait this pandemic out and see what, you know, how are movies going to be released on a platform basis. And independent films typically have been released on, you know, in theaters on a platform basis. So I think we're all pretty optimistic that will come back. So I don't think the pandemic has put a bullet in anything, so to speak.
Yeah. Well, I definitely want to unpack that a little bit more, because I think, you know, it's always fun to make predictions of what it's going to look like a year or two from now. Right. But I want to go back to this point that you made around, you know, do you release on a streamer or do you release in theaters? Of course, actors, actresses, directors, producers want that larger exposure. But I think a lot of our viewing audience is thinking to themselves, okay, well, if I get this movie on a streamer with one click of a button, I can now go out to tons and tons of people versus having to create that buzz to get people to go pay whatever it is. You know, I feel like it's growing all the time, like $18, $20 to go to the movies now. But something interesting that we talked about yesterday was this release of Palm Springs and that reaction of people in the theater. So I'd love for you to tease out a little bit for us, how important is that viewing experience for an independent film when it does release in theaters versus just me sitting at home, you know, eating my popcorn on my couch all by my lonesome watching Palm Springs?
I think those are two questions. There's two questions there, Jim. I think the one I'll let you take over, but for me, the initial release of that film was at the Sundance Film Festival, and that's really important. It wasn't a theater it was a festival, but that festival provided an environment that allowed that film to be seen exactly how the filmmakers intended, in a room in the library with, you know, with sort of the dynamic of laughter, and they got it. And that's really what sort of spread. So that's what we talk about when we see that experiential moment that you get at a festival. That would you have gotten that if you went straight on a streaming site, you know, in that moment? How would you have created that buzz?
100%. And that's what I was gonna say too. That was like one of the funnest screenings I've ever been to. You know, people love the movie. And so coming out of the movie, I mean, everybody wanted to buy that movie because they were all in the room. They all saw, you know, the reaction. Everybody loved it. And you can't replicate that by, you know, virtual screenings, unfortunately. But, something that I think has been a little forgotten with Palm Springs was, part of the reason Hulu ultimately won the day on that was because they had included in their presentation to the, to the filmmakers and the cast and everybody was they had a theatrical release commitment. They partnered with Neon and the movie, and it was really important to everybody involved that the movie was going to have a traditional theatrical release window. And that was part of the deal. And unfortunately, COVID just, killed that. But, I think it's been forgotten because everybody's now found it on Hulu anyway, and it's a big success. But that was meant to have a theatrical release. And kind of the part of it that's important is much as arguably you get more eyeballs on a movie by having it on a platform, in some cases, but you also don't necessarily get the buzz you get with, a platform theatrical release where there's buzz and people are talking about it. And we've all watched how these movies gain momentum with good marketing and distribution and good reviews and everything. So
yeah, and I'd say though, but in this case, because Palm Springs is receiving, a lot of notice, it's still because it got that release at Sundance and it created that buzz and it went to that festival that started the cycle. So had you not had that, right? Had you not had the experience at a festival, how would it have looked? That's the big question. What would the reviews have been? How would it have been perceived? And so, to us, yes, the importance of the theatrical experience is vital. And also the importance of these festivals that create these opportunities.
Definitely. Because I think the picture that you paint, right, of when Palm Springs was released at Sundance, you're in a library, it makes me think of Parasite last year. I'll be honest, if it hadn't been the Oscar movie, if it hadn't had all of that buzz, I would have turned it on at home, watched 20 minutes of it and gone, what on earth am I watching? But because there was all this credibility behind it, not only had it won a bunch of awards, but there were so many reviews out there that this was something worth watching, worth getting through the subtitles and everything. I stayed with it and I loved the film. But I'm curious about, there's so much content out here now, right? It seems like every studio has their own streaming platform. You have all the platforms like Netflix, Amazon, Apple, the big tech companies are getting involved. You have social media companies becoming content platforms, it feels like TikTok. So independent film has a niche audience. How are you cutting through all of that? How are you getting that message out there that when I turn on my TV, when I hopefully go back to the movie theaters and however long it is, that I really do need to see that type of film versus the 50 million other choices that I'm bombarded with?
You're talking about now, like well, I mean, it's a really good question. I think that's why, we tend to see, Jim and I talked about this even last night, just you see a lot more star-driven, bigger budgeted films on Netflix because there's that recognition of an actor or a filmmaker you are interested in seeing, and the independent films like The Lady Birds and The Farewell and Big Sick that we've had the pleasure of working on, Call Me by Your Name. These are films that were discovered in the theaters and not just discovered, but the performances would they have gotten the same recognition if they were just put on screen? Hard to say. Would people have tuned in? I mean, that's where it becomes the muscle of the streamer, and the muscle behind the machine is how many of those can Netflix or Amazon or Hulu, HBO Max, how many of those can they actually, really promote? Because there are a lot of them, as you said. There's a lot of noise online. I never know where to go myself, and so you go to the easy place, right? It's like, do I go on Netflix today, HBO Max? What was I watching? Where? Which is why, to me, the easy place is something that has 4 or 5 episodes, so I can just go right back. But I think that's the thing: is how do you get the audience to go to see a movie with Brie Larson and Jacob Tremblay about a story that's a little daunting? How do you get them online? But we know exactly how you do it in the theaters. And that's why Jim and I are, really confident that the theatrical experience is not going away. I think we saw it again before the pandemic. really bifurcated in those big studio films or those very specific awards winning. I don't even like to call them art house because some of them end up being commercial, but that's really, there was a very little middle ground. And that's why you started seeing, you know, the theatrical experience a little bit different, in that you're either going to go to that art house crowd, those theaters, or you're going to be the blockbuster. And sometimes you go back and forth, but I think we're going to see more of that. I think that the films that A24 and Sony Classics and Neon and Roadside and Fox Searchlight and Focus release are the kind of movies that are still, people are still going to want to see. And I think more so now than ever. Maybe a few months ago we thought, we're not sure, but I think they're going to be very eager to go back to the theater. And
those distributors are sitting on some really good movies right now. And you know, your question about how do we cut through that, you know, part of it is knowing your movie, like when we're packaging and raising financing for these movies and making decisions about what's the best home for these movies. You know, you do have to be aware of what your movie is, and all those companies that Reena just listed are still on the top of our lists of places to go with movies. You know, nobody's abandoned that by any stretch. So, you know, if your movie is going to be better suited being distributed by one of them, then we're going to take the movie there first and, you know, give them a chance to make it.
And there are others, IFC, Magnolia, there's plenty of, you know, that's their bread and butter, the theatrical distribution business. I think that will change the windowing. I mean, and it's interesting because I was just looking through a bunch of the films from a few years ago, like I, Tonya, which ended up doing, you know, massive, you know, business, or Lady Bird, which was close to 78 million worldwide. Those were films that had time to sort of sit in the theaters and get discovered. So the big question is going to be, how is the windowing going to look? Will people stay, you know, continue to go to the theaters? Can you stretch it out that long, or will that be contracting? And that's what we're starting to see now, is just the contraction of the windowing of when, you know, you're going out to the theater now, because we don't really have that many theaters open, and you'll see 2 weeks, 28 days, you know, commitments that are much shorter. And the theater chains are actually finally agreeing to it, because that was the big hiccup before, is they wouldn't allow it. So that's going to be a really interesting thing to observe once our theaters open up again.
Yeah, I loved Tanya. That's what made my sport from my former life, figure skating, popular in a negative way. So it was fun to see that play out. I think Margot Robbie was a more aesthetically pleasing version of Tonya Harding, but it was good for the screen. Yeah. So I want to go back to something though, and push you a little bit, because I'm with you. I love these movies. I think that they are going to have an audience, but let's play this out a year or two in the future, right? We're hopefully out of the pandemic, or, you know, God forbid, this becomes more of a flu every type of year, just a little bit more dangerous. And we deal with something like this, some sort of remote, everything closing down every year. I'm not speaking it into existence, but it's a possibility that's on the table. So when all of those films that different studios are sitting on right now, they've gone through, they've come out, and you're now going on this next round. So it's 2 years out, and you're trying to convince folks, okay, these films need to get made. Now, I think we can all agree more folks are more convinced that those big blockbuster superhero action movie star driven films are more of a sure hit versus a Lady Bird, which ended up being a hit, but there needed to be that discovery time. How are you going out and convincing folks that this audience exists? This deserves to be made. This deserves to have its chance to cut through all of that content. Because I'm wondering if at the end of all of this, we're just going to see folks a little bit more reticent to take risks on these more nuanced artistic films than, you know, the clear ones that of course everyone's going to go see.
Well, you know, I mean, not to push for any one thing, but I mean, Rotten Tomatoes now is a real bellwether for movies. You know, critical response, and Rotten Tomatoes seems to be the at least one of the go-to platforms for, you know, making decisions. I still think, you know, critical response and audience response is gonna dictate what happens with movies. So if you need to cut through what you want to go see in a theater, a lot of people will go look at, reviews
True.
from whoever it is, and make decisions about that, or word of mouth. But I don't think you can really just expect independent films to compete with, tentpole movies without it.
And are you talking about how do we convince people to make these movies? Was that the question you were also asking?
Right. So, I mean, how do you get people to put financing behind these movies in a world where things are even more bifurcated than they already are potentially at the end of this?
I mean, believe it or not, there are a lot of financiers that are driven by story. I mean, they really are. The equity investors in the independent sector, these are the movies they want to make, and they are risk takers. And I think the thing that we might see more of is, tighter budgets, a little bit more conservative, perhaps in the beginning, to see how, things fare in the next few years. But I don't think it's going to stop. I think it's story. It just, things become more important. The script, the story, the package, it just becomes more important. And in the information we gather in the marketplace, we bring to the financiers, and that's the global marketplace. It's not just the US marketplace, but we're constantly on the phone with the buyers, hearing about the things they want and are looking for. And that's really what helps us, dictate, and not dictate, it's the wrong word, is really target what is actually going to be feasible and easier to finance. But I do think budgets are going to be something that will be important, because you can't rely on the streamer, right? I can always sell it to a streamer. That's the easy way out, but you have to think, what's my worst case scenario? And that's typically how independent films are financed anyway. You think of your worst case scenario, meaning what can I get in all the markets overseas, and what can I get as the worst case in the US, knowing that this film is going to get released because it's an extraordinary package. And that ultimately becomes your budget. What tax incentives exist? It's really about being smart.
Yeah.
And the other thing I'd throw in is, the ecosystem for independent film is different than the studio system in a lot of ways. There's a lot of, and I think there's going to be, at least a reliability and credibility. Maybe that'll be a little bit more important going forward, of who's involved with these movies, not just, who the filmmaker is, but sort of who's the producer, frankly, who's the financier in the first place. All that maybe will be a little bit, more important, and maybe some movies won't get made, and maybe they shouldn't get made. But I think protecting that ecosystem is really important. That's kind of what we've also talked about.
Does then that mean that we're going to have less discovery of the next director, the next writer, the next producer, because they don't have that track record, to say, yeah, okay, this is going to be a hit?
Not at all, because there are financiers out there that are really supporting the arts. And many of these films get made by piecing financing together. And I say absolutely not. We are going to keep, I think as Jim said, the ecosystem wants it on a global basis. And if they don't come from here, they're coming from somewhere.
Sure.
So.
Yeah. I want to follow up on a point that you just brought back into the conversation about this global audience for these films. Of course, before the pandemic, screens were popping up in China at an incredible rate. And that global, film at the box office has become, I think, more important in some respects than the US figure. So how does streaming impact how you're reaching a global audience for these independent films? And if there isn't that US release, that US buzz, how are you thinking about creating that buzz globally?
Well, it's really how the independent business works. If you don't have a studio that buys the worldwide rights, or a streamer that buys the worldwide rights, you are working with international sales agents who then take those films and go to Australia, Japan, France, and oftentimes it happens at festivals or sales markets, where you're selling the rights to individual theatrical distribution companies in those territories. So France will have a set of its neons and A24s and searchlights, and that's a really important part of our business. It's been, you've heard about, I mean, we've all, witnessed the issue in France, because France is a very, very specific, I think their holdback for streaming is like 3 years. I don't know how that's going to change. I'm pretty sure that's what it is. So Netflix was it was a very complicated thing in Europe, much more complicated when Netflix started spreading out. But if they can utilize the streaming world the way we do in the theatrical marketplace, so if that becomes an ancillary sale or just, downstream, it works. But the films will get distribution on a global basis the same way they get distributed as if you're a studio. It just is not by the studio, it's by independent distributors.
Okay, so we're running up on time. I have one more question I want to ask you, but I also want to grab this from the chat. I know this isn't necessarily your bread and butter of what you do every day, but I imagine you'll have an opinion on this. So Brian Allman wanted to ask, how long can the theatrical distributors hold out on their real estate holdings, do you think, to keep competing with streaming services and their reduced hard costs as this pandemic drags on?
I can say I really don't know the answer to that question. It's a good question, and the question that was going around, maybe a few months ago, I don't know if it's 6 months ago, was whether the major studios, because the major studios are now allowed to, I think, own, cinema chains or exhibition, which they didn't used to be able to own. And the question was whether they were going to buy up the, exhibition chains. So there was speculation Amazon would buy out, maybe it was Landmark or whoever, or Disney might buy out, Regal or one, I don't know, don't quote me on any of this, but that was the speculation, was that the studios would buy out the exhibition chains, take the real estate, presumably, but also use the theaters almost like captive marketing and releasing, venues. It hasn't happened yet. I could see it happening because I'm sure the exhibitors are super stressed. And I don't know, maybe there's a version of that where, that might be a good thing to help rescue the exhibition chains. But I really couldn't speculate on that. It's a really good question. And I think we're all really hopeful they can hold out.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so last question. I'm switching gears a little bit here. I've always found independent films, far more creative, to be frank, than, these big blockbusters. But data is becoming so important in the film industry, in every industry. But I've kind of always thought about that as a bit at odds with these more creative, genius projects that get born out of a great story, rather than what's going to resonate best with the audience, what's going to, make sure that people watch the full film on Netflix versus just the first 5 minutes. But I'm curious, as this becomes more of an important aspect of your industry, how does data play a role when you're thinking about packaging independent films, when you're thinking about who stars in them, who directs, and just how is that playing out in your world?
I mean, information is everything, right? The more data you have on something is just a sales tool to sometimes share, the reach of a particular actor, or, we use that all the time. In fact, it's a really important part of selling anything, is understanding the value of that particular person, package, actor, film, story, what's something similar to that story that's done really well. And sometimes it's important to know what not to talk about because something doesn't work. So it's vital to have the data.
One other piece about data, obviously the streamers have their algorithms and they're not sharing, what their success or lack of success on their platforms is, so they're not sharing the viewing of whether it's on a unit basis or a length basis or audience basis of stuff on the platform. So, like at our agency, we have a research department that's, we're digging in on our own to sort of track what we think the, what's a success on a platform and a streaming platform. And it's amazing the amount of data that you still can get, even if it's not being shared by the streamers. And it's something all the agencies are really pushing for is, give us some kind of success metrics. Box office used to serve that really well for the industry. And now that's not relevant with the streaming companies. They're on a different business model. We want to, bottom line is we want to share in sort of things that are successful on the platforms, and we think there ought to be metrics for it, and that's where the data comes in. So,
and look, and then if we have to lean to what's their social, that helps too, because that particular person can reach X number of people. So it really goes hand in hand. But I'd say what's interesting is like, Netflix will share data and certain successes. I mean, we knew that 34 million households watched The Social Dilemma in that first, 10. I mean, we had some information. So when it's pretty astounding information, they do share it. But it's not for everything. So it becomes harder. Yeah. And sometimes for them, it doesn't even matter. Who knows? Like it's, they're a machine. Their algorithms are for their own purposes. But for us, it's vital information that would be very helpful to get.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's so interesting how the metrics are changing because, in TV, it used to be, what were your Nielsen ratings? In film, it's how many people went to the box office. And now it's this murky, what even defines a hit anymore when it's just sent out to X amount of million subscribers, you're already, closing that window. So
well, they can self-define, right? I mean, in theory,
right.
Say, it's a hit. And then everyone goes to watch it. Hard to say. Or it becomes the word of mouth, which creates the hit, which is true. I mean, you've seen that with, I see it with my daughter, the Queen's Gambit, or we're all going to watch The Flight Attendant, or and it becomes a sort of social, on social media, it becomes active, and therefore it creates its own hit.
Right.
But we still don't have.
Well, that is a whole other topic.
Yeah,
who knows what that's going to look like over the next year. Well, listen, I could talk about this topic for hours, but we are out of time. So Reena, Jim, thank you so much for sharing your insights today. I really appreciated your time and giving us a look into the world of independent film.
Thanks, Kelly.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
And thank you to Troy and Sam as well. And finally, thank you all for joining us to dig into this fascinating topic. I'm biased. I think it's the most interesting out there. But if you want to share the event with anyone that wasn't able to attend, a full playback is going to be available on our website by the end of the day. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to our social channels, subscribe to our newsletter so that you don't miss any of the awesome events we're going to have for you in 2021. So stay safe and have a good rest of the week, everyone.